This video's random fact is, eating 3 bars of dark chocolate a month can reduce your risk of heart failure by 13%. The more you know. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Super Nintendo Classic because recently I did get my hands on the Super Nintendo Classic, and I actually want to talk about the Super Nintendo Classic. What do I think of the Super Nintendo Classic? Do I like the Super Nintendo Classic? What do I think about it? And I'm also going to compare it to other plug-and-play systems on the market, whether you're talking about the NES Classic or the upcoming PS1 Classic that's coming right around the corner in December. So I am going to compare this to other plug-and-plays on the market currently. But here is what the Super Nintendo Classic looked like. As you can see, this thing fits in the palm of my hands, and it's very lightweight and a very small box. This thing comes in at around $80, so you're going to be talking about $80 if you want to buy this thing. This thing comes with 21 built-in games, and you got most of the hard hitters when it comes to the Super Nintendo. So most likely you're going to be able to find a game that you're going to like from the Super Nintendo, and you're going to be able to play. There's a couple games missing here or there, but for the most part, I think all the games that Nintendo selected for the Super Nintendo Classic, I think they did a spot-on job. And on top of that, you also get an unreleased game that was never on the Super Nintendo in the first place. You get Star Fox 2. The one thing I did notice about Star Fox 2 on here is you have to actually unlock it, but it's very simple to unlock Star Fox 2. What you basically have to do with Star Fox 2, you basically have to beat the first level of the original Star Fox. Once you beat the first level of Star Fox, it'll let you play Star Fox 2 on here. But it is nice, they are giving you an unreleased game on here, and that's something very cool because, of course, nobody back in the day really got to experience Star Fox 2, so it's nice they finally released a game they've already had done for many years, finally on this thing. Overall, what I can say is I've been playing this now for about a week now, and what I can say is I'm actually having quite fun with my Super Nintendo Classic. I know some of you out there may be saying, why did I actually buy this? Can't you just use an emulator, and can't you use different devices to emulate games and do pretty much the exact same thing this does, and you can save your money? Yes, that is true, but there are some downsides to doing that, and of course there are some reasons why you may want to buy the Super Nintendo Classic over just emulating your games on your PC, your smartphone, whatever device you have. There's other reasons why you want to buy this. One reason you would want to buy this over doing emulation is the fact that doing this over emulation means that you get 21 ROMs already on here, or 21 games already built on, so you don't have to scatter the internet trying to find all the ROMs that you want to play. Also, when it comes to ROMs, it's kind of a gray area whether it's illegal or not, so that can be kind of a sketchy area. I'm not really going to get into all that, whether it's legal or not when it comes to downloading ROMs, but that could be quite sketchy. Also, when you do emulation on different devices, you don't get the same interface you'd be getting on the Super Nintendo Classic, and Nintendo did a fantastic job of the actual user interface of this box. It even has music on the main menu. You get 4 save states when it comes to saving your games, so you can save 4 different times on each individual game, and on top of that, you got different settings, like you can put borders around the game. You can also change the way the game looks, whether you want 4:3 pixel perfect mode or you want CTR scan lines, so you can do that. And on top of this, Nintendo does give you manuals. The manuals aren't on the Super Nintendo Classic itself, but what you can do is you can scan the screen with your smartphone, and then you can get the manuals to come up on your smart device, whether you're talking about your smartphone or your tablet, and I think that is very cool. And overall, I just really like the vibe out of this, and on top of that, you are supporting Nintendo, so it is nice that you are legally supporting Nintendo when you buy one of these. And of course, like I said, this thing does look like the Super Nintendo itself. It's just very small and very convenient, and on top of that, this thing is very easy to set up on your modern TV. So basically, you just plug in an HDMI cable to your TV, and then you plug in a micro USB cable to a power brick that plugs into the wall. They give you one in the box, or you can actually take the USB cable that's included in the box, and you can actually run it to your TV's USB port. If your TV has a USB port, you can actually do that, and it is actually safe because in the box, if you read the manual, they do actually give you they do actually tell you it is safe to use the USB port on your TV if you want to use the USB port on your TV. I just thought that was something kind of interesting, so you So you can do that if you want to do that. And on top of that, it's just more convenient to plug this thing in. It's all ready to go. Nice interface, clean everything, just very easy. And on top of that, you are using the original controller. It's not the original one from back in the day. It's a replica of it, but it is pretty spot on from what I'm hearing on the internet. I can't confirm or deny that just because I don't have a real Super Nintendo controller to compare the one that comes with this, but a lot of people are saying it's pretty much spot on. Here's what the actual controller looks like that comes in the box with this thing. Here is the Super Nintendo controller right here, and what I can say is it does feel really nice in the hand. One thing I didn't even realize, just talking about Super Nintendo or retro games in general, I didn't even realize how good the D-pad is on the Super Nintendo controller. Honestly, for me personally, I think it's one of my favorite D-pads. I definitely like it better than most modern D-pads in my opinion. I think it's better than the D-pad on the Nintendo Switch's Pro controller, the Wii U's Pro controller, PS4 controller, PS3 controller. I just love the D-pad on here. I didn't even know how good the D-pad was on a Super Nintendo controller. One nice thing they do give you in the boxes with the controller, they actually give you a pretty long cord when it comes to the actual cord for this thing. Of course, as you guys know, with the NES Classic, a lot of people were complaining that the NES Classic controller didn't have a long enough cord, and you might be asking yourself, why didn't they just go with a wireless controller? Well, I can think of two reasons why they didn't go with a wireless controller in the box. One, it's going to cost more. Even if it's just slightly more is still more money they have to put out of their pocket, and if you're talking about all the units that they're making, that adds up over time. So if it saves them money in the long run, yes, go wired. And second of all, I think the reason they wanted to go with a wired controller is because they want the genuine feel of actually playing it back in the day. So it's kind of like that nostalgia talking, and that's why they did this. So people who played it back in the day will remember having to have a wire, and here's the wire right here. But I'm just glad they give you a pretty long cable. And what I can say is I've had personally no problems with trying to play my system on the TV. I think the cord is quite long enough. Honestly, if you're still having problems with this, they do make wireless controllers from like 8-Bit Duo or just different companies out there, and you can buy a wireless controller if you want to buy a wireless controller. You can also buy an extender that plugs into here, and you can plug it into the Super Nintendo Classic. One thing also, talking about the Super Nintendo Classic, I just wanted to talk about this, which I think is cool. You see this right here, this plug right here, if you're not aware, this is actually the one from the Wii controllers. So this will plug into a Wiimote, and you can use this on a Wii if you actually want to, which I thought was actually pretty cool thing from Nintendo. Actually, it would have been even cooler if Nintendo just went USB on this thing for the controllers. Reason being is USB is a little bit slightly smaller than this cable right here, and on top of that, you probably would have been able to use them on the computer if they went with USB controllers instead of the proprietary Wii cable right here. But I just thought I would point that out. Overall, I don't really have any cons with this system. I think it looks really good on an HD TV. I think a lot of these games look better than what they did back in the day. Of course, if you play in pixel perfect mode or 4:3 mode, they're definitely going to look better than what they did back in the day. I was playing Yoshi's Island on here, which is absolutely, like, hands down maybe now one of my favorite games of all time. Yes, it's just so creative and so fantastic. Whether you're talking about the music of the game, the art style of the game, just everything of that game, it just signed beautifully. Honestly, I'll give that game like a 9.5 out of 10. There's some problems with it, but overall, a very good game. I don't want to get sidetracked there, but like I was saying, this thing does play games very good. I didn't notice any hiccups when playing different games on here. I didn't notice any tearing in the screen. I didn't notice anything bad with this system. You just boot it on, and literally in seconds you're up and running and playing games. I do have one con with the Super Nintendo Classic, which I'm not really a fan of, and I think a lot of people out there can agree this is a flaw with the Super Nintendo Classic. One flaw with the Super Nintendo Classic is when you go to actually switch games or you want to save your game, you cannot do that on the controller. So anytime you want to go back to the main menu to switch games or save your game, you have to physically get up and press the reset button on the actual console right here. So here's the power button and here's the reset button. You have to get up, press the reset button, and it'll take you back to the main menu of the actual system. And then from there, you can either switch games or you can actually save state your games. And I thought that was kind of ridiculous. They could have made a button combination on the actual controller that could have allowed you to go back to the main menu of the system, which is kind of suck, especially if this is in a weird spot. So you're gonna have to make sure that this is always accessible and ready when you're saving games or switching games, which is just kind of a little bit ridiculous, and it does kind of suck. You have to keep getting up and pressing the reset button every time you want to do that. I just thought I would point that out, and I'm not really a fan of that. Now let's talk about the Super Nintendo versus the NES NES Classic and versus the PS1 Classic, because those are the hard hitters right now when it comes to plug and play systems. Honestly, if you were to ask me, I would personally go with the Super Nintendo Classic. Yes, I have it right here, and I'm going to talk about why I went with the Super Nintendo Classic over the PS1 Classic that's coming out in December, or whether you're talking about the NES Classic that's been out for quite some time now. I'm going to talk about why I went with the Super Nintendo Classic. The reason I went with the Super Nintendo Classic over something like the NES Classic or the PS1 Classic that's coming out in December is the fact that I think this is the sweet spot for gaming. If you ask me personally, this is just my personal taste. Everyone has their own different personal taste, and it depends on your nostalgia too. I did not grow up with any of these systems besides the PS1 that's coming out in December. I did grow up with the PS1. I've already talked about this on my channel, but I did grow up with the PS1, and I didn't grow up with any Nintendo consoles outside of the Game Boy, so none of these are really nostalgic to me except for the PS1. But the reason I went with the Super Nintendo Classic is because I love 16-bit graphics. I think 16-bit graphics are just the sweet spot for games. I'm not really a fan of 8-bit games. Honestly, for me, 8-bit's a little bit too old, and on top of the graphics being a little bit too old, I don't think the games are all that complex. If you look at a NES controller, the NES controller only has 2 buttons on it, and it has a D-pad, so no shoulder buttons on the back, and no more face buttons. So it doesn't have 4 face buttons, just like the Super Nintendo controller, and the Super Nintendo controller has two shoulder buttons on the back. What does that actually mean? It actually means that games are going to be more complex, not just the graphics being better, but games are going to be more complex because there's more buttons to work with on a Super Nintendo controller. I just don't like how simple NES games are. For some people, those may be great, that those games are simple and they're not all too complicated, but I just can't stand the graphics, and I can't stand that there's not enough depth with those NES games. So that's personally not for me. I still think at what, $60, it's not really all that bad of a deal. If you can get your hands on an NES Classic, then go ahead and go for the NES Classic. I think it's a great system, but honestly, I think you're just better off stepping up to the Super Nintendo Classic at $80. Yes, you're paying $20 more than the NES Classic, but games are just going to look better, and also they're going to be more complex because, of course, like I said, the controller has more buttons on it to offer. So overall, I think this is the sweet spot when it comes to actual games. And let's talk about the PS1 Classic really quickly. Why didn't I go with the PS1 Classic? Because like I said, I just told you guys, I grew up with the PS1, so you would think the PS1 Classic would be nostalgic for me, but there's a number of reasons why I'm not going with the PS1 Classic. First of all, the PS1 Classic is going to be higher than this at $80. The PS1 Classic is $100, and that's not including tax. And depending on your state, tax can be quite high, so it could get up to like $105, $106, depending on where you are. But besides that, one thing I don't like about the PS1 Classic, I don't like the PS1 Classic because the user interface is not that great. On top of that, the game library is not that good. Where's my Crash Bandicoot that I grew up with? Where is Spyro? Where's some other games on that console? I'm just not really a fan of the lineup of that game, of that system. But one of the biggest flaws of the PS1, it's not necessarily the PS1 Classic's fault, it's more or less the PS1 era of gaming's fault. The fact that a lot of 3D games, because that one pretty much has more 3D games than these, like actual real open world games. Not really open world, but 3D based environments. A lot of those games are 3D based, whether you're talking about Metal Gear, whether you're talking about Tekken, which is 3D models on the actual screen. One problem with PS1 era games, a lot of them anyway, is the fact that a lot of them just don't look great. They didn't really age all that well. And when you try to go back and play some of these retro games back on the PS1 Classic, they just don't look all that well. And I know one game that doesn't really age well too is that one game with an R. I forgot the name of the actual game I'm trying to talk about, but there was a game with the R. Rainbow Six, there you go. Rainbow Six didn't age all that well. Just pretty much a lot of games on the PS1 Classic didn't age all that well when you try to go back to them. And for me personally, I just don't know if I can actually go back to the PS1 with all the problems it has. They're missing games, the interface ain't all that great. And on top of that, I forgot to mention as well, they don't have a lot of features on it. So when it comes to actually changing the quality of, changing the way the games look on the TV, changing the to stage, putting borders around the game, things like that. You can't really do all that on the PS1 Classic. Sony pretty much got lazy with the PS1 Classic, so that's why I decided to go with this. But either way, no matter what you end up going with, I think overall, in general, I think these plug-and-play systems are just very good systems. They have the games already built on, and we all know how expensive retro gaming can be. Retro gaming can be very expensive when you're trying to buy all the games for these systems, trying to buy the actual system itself. Who knows how long the system has been around, and if it's still working in good condition. And of course, a lot of the time, especially with these older systems, whether you're talking about the NES or especially the Super Nintendo, a lot of these older systems do tend to yellow, so it's just better off getting one of these and playing this. It does suck that you are stuck to 21 games and you can't really do anything about that. It would have been cool if they made it a little bit wider and they actually put an actual real cartridge slot on here to play physical games. That would have been cool. You would have the 21 games built on, and then you would have had the actual cartridge slot to plug in more cartridges to the system. Actually, one company already did that. At Games did that with the Sega Genesis plug-and-play console, but that console wasn't great at all. It had emulation problems, sound problems. The system wasn't made all that well overall. There's a number of problems with that, but that was just a cool feature Nintendo could have implemented with these. Also, what Nintendo could have implemented, which I'm just thinking about stuff, is they could have actually had like the eShop on here, or like with the Wii U and the 3DS, where they have virtual console games, and maybe you go ahead and go to the store, but the only thing you can buy at the store would be virtual console games. That actually would have been cool, and it would have benefited the customer, and it would have benefited Nintendo, because we all know there's people out there like me who'll buy Super Mario Brothers 3, 4, 5 times in a row, and we'll waste all of our money on that thing. So if Nintendo did that, that would have been great. But then again, it would have added to the price, because you would have needed a Wi-Fi chip in here and things like that. And I think one reason why Nintendo didn't want to do that with the Super Nintendo Classic, just talking about things, I think they didn't want to do that with the NES or the Super Nintendo Classic, is because hacking would have been a big deal. You know, someone's going to find a way to actually break through the eShop if they put virtual console games to download. Someone would have found a way to get those games on the eShop for free. We know that's going to be a thing, and they want to try to limit piracy and try to limit hacking to a minimum. So I think that's why they decided to go and skip that. But either way, yes, I'm loving my Super Nintendo Classic. I think it's a very good deal at $80. Definitely go for it. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out. Boop.